evening. I'm delighted that we have Professor Robin Dunbar with us. I think Professor Dunbar has spoken to us in the past, but quite a while ago.
Yes.
During the 2009, when we were celebrating the 150th anniversary of the origin of species. Professor Dunbar is a biological anthropologist and an evolutionary psychologist and a specialist in primate behavior. He's Professor Emeritus of Evolutionary Psychology in the Social and Evolutionary Neuroscience Research Group in the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford. So this evening, I'm very much looking forward to hearing his talk. Robin.
Thank you very much. Good. Well, thank you for inviting me back again. I obviously didn't disgrace myself last time. This is going to be rather a different talk to the one I gave many years ago. And it arose out of a project that we did it finished just before lockdown, in fact, and COVID, fortunately perhaps, on the evolution, essentially the evolution of religion and how it comes to be. It was funded by the Templeton Foundation. And so we had sort of fairly, well, by our standards, large team of people working on aspects of it, but it was actually building on a lot of my earlier work. But we did actually have, as part of it, in fact, the two lead people on it were both Anglican priests. So it has some theological credibility, I think. But there were a wide range of people involved, psychologists, evolutionary biologists, cognitive psychologists, and so on. And the essence really is, how is it that religion or religiosity came to be with our particular species? What are its origins, and why are we... I'm just looking desperately here for the mechanism. Oh, okay, got it. Why has religion, how has religion evolved? So let me start very briefly with a very brief history of the development or history of religion, as you might say, as we really broadly accepted it for probably about the last century, really, from this essentially goes back to the late Victorians. And their view was that the earliest religions were very much of the kind represented here. These are Kung San Bushmen from southern Africa, engaged in a trance dance. You can see the men dancing in a circle around the fire, and outside them, sitting on the ground, are the women who provide the musical accompaniment to it. And the men, the physical exertions of this dancing causes the men to go into trance. And down below at the bottom, the cartoon is actually a prehistoric cave painting from about 2,000 years ago in South Africa, which very, very clearly shows a trance dance of this kind. You've got the men on the left. The man on the extreme left appears to be falling down in trance. You can see the man in the middle there with holding his dancing stick, which you can see two of the men in the picture above holding dancing sticks. And then on the right-hand side, the women providing the accompaniment again. So religion starts here. It's a form of religion with no gods, no formal gods. There is a spirit world because that's where you go when you enter into trance. But there are no gods. There are no moral codes handed down from on high. People have moral codes, but their moral codes are the kind, well, that's how we've always done these things. You know, there's no prescription to them, as it were. There's no formal reason for doing so in terms of some higher authority. And then at the end of the sequence, you end up many thousands of years later with modern world religions, Catholic High Mass at the top, and but the picture below is Zoroastrians, Parsis, as you might better know them now. And I put the Zoroastrians up because they're kind of interesting in the history of religion, because the Jews, when they were dragged off to captivity in Iraq, or what is now Iraq, came into contact with Parsis and with Zoroastrianism as such, and Zoroastrian beliefs really started to infiltrate and get embedded into early Jewish religion, and through Judaism then found their way into Christianity and presumably Islam as well. And I illustrate this here. You'll notice the fire in the container that the priests are standing around. It's sometimes known as the fire religion because fire is so important, but that the importance of fire is still represented even in modern Christianity, at least in the sort of Catholic end, by the sanctuary lamp. That's where the sanctuary lamps comes from. But in between these two is sort of the beginning and the end, as it were. There's a phase in the middle which seems to be represented by these kind of polytheistic religions. So the religions on the right are all monotheistic, but you have this phase of polytheistic religions where you have many gods, and this is a real change from hunter-gatherer type trance-based religions, in that you now have a priesthood, you have temples, you have moral codes handed down from on high. But there are many gods, and the gods tend to be rather vindictive. They require sacrifices constantly, otherwise they get very annoyed. In contrast to the kind of gods of most of the monotheistic religions, who are much more benign and genuinely interested in the behavior and prospects of their followers on earth, as it were. Whereas this intermediate phase, this sort of early doctrinal phase of doctrinal religions, gods tend to be quite disinterested. So like the Greek gods, classical Greek gods, for example, pretty disinterested in what humans actually do, but you just have to keep sacrificing to them, otherwise you're in trouble. So that's the sort of grand story we're trying to explain. What's emerged out of looking at hunter-gatherer religions over the last decade by a number of people is what appears to be a very clear sequence, in that animism appears very early on, a sense of there are spirits, there's a spirit world, and the world is imbued with spirits, and objects in the world out there, whether it's rivers or mountains or trees or springs, are all imbued with their own individual spirits. There's a spirit world which you can go into during trance, which again consists of both good spirits who tend to be ancestors and bad spirits who tend to be attempt to prevent you getting back out of trance, back to the real world, which if you can't get out because you lose the entrance and because they've distracted you and taken you off somewhere else in the spirit world, then you will die. And I assume this probably so exercises these trance-based religions that I suspect that what's actually happened is that people actually do sometimes die from overexertion of going into trance, dancing too heavily. But from that very early animistic phase, you get the appearance of shamans who can control the world to some extent, providing cures for health and so on. And that seems to produce a belief in an afterlife, which didn't exist before, and very much a sense of ancestor worship. And then finally, as a third stage, but very late on, you get high gods appearing. So there's again this transition through a series of phases in the history of religion, which kind of raises questions as to why these happened. The point I want to emphasize in this context is how important trance is in all the modern religions still. The argument, I suppose, is that these phases in the history of religion, the evolution of religion, are not cases where one phase replaces another. What they are is augmentation. So that original mystical trance-based component of hunter-gatherer religions is still there in all the modern religions. The hierarchies don't often very like it because it's very uncontrollable, and they regard as the bane of their life, and it tends to create rather heretical theologies very often in the modern context. So they tend to look down on the mystical elements with some trepidation and concern, but they're all there. So you may be familiar with the picture in the middle of the whirling dervishes, so-called, the Badlavi Sufi sect in Islam, mainly based in Turkey, where they use the spinning dance to get themselves into a trance state. There's a very, very strong tradition of this kind of mystical trance-based form of religion in Islam, forming the Sufi tradition, but it's mainly confined to the Shia. The Sufis don't like it at all, but it's quite heavy in the Shia tradition, running across into what's now Pakistan and northwest India, where very often singing is used to create this sense or induce trance. And on the right, just to give the Christian equivalent, because mysticism has held a very strong sway through the history of Christianity, is famous Saint Teresa of Avila, the 17th century, 16th century Spanish mystic, one of the now one of the 38, I think, doctors of the Catholic Church, and one of the few women that are actually regarded as so important doctrinally that they're gathered together in this honorific society of the doctors of the church, as it were. But the point is, this mystical tradition is still with us, has been with us, won't go away, and we still find it all over the place in the context of things like foretelling the future, reading horoscopes is still very popular, I think. Avoiding bad luck and evil eye, which was really prevalent in the Mediterranean areas, well into the post-Second World War, to the 1950s, and probably still is. Praying for success in ventures. You only need to go into an Anglican church and just look to the left or right of the entrance door. There will be a prayer board there asking for your intercession, your prayers for somebody's illness or somebody's project or exams or something like that. Seeking talismans for success in love or success in business, for curing illnesses, and indeed absolving the dead of their sins by lighting candles and saying prayers for them. And here are just a few examples of things, crosses as to wear around the neck and so on. St. Nonswell in Pembrokeshire, very ancient Celtic saint, woman saint, whose holy waters from the well are very good for your health and so on. Of course, famously, the Oracle of Delphi, who for 1,000 years sat over these vents in the ground in the temple, being fumigated by some very noxious fumes from underground and going into trance and offering you advice and wisdom, which was always impenetrable, but you went away feeling you'd learned something. And here, one of the oddest of the things I think I'd ever come across, I came across it by accident watching the archaeology work going on in the centre of Birmingham for the railway station there, for the new HS1, if it ever gets finished. They've had to dig up an entire cemetery from the late 19th century. I suspect a lot of my ancestors are actually buried, but we're too poor to have have tombstones or anything. But what they came across was several people with china plates on their chests, so several bodies with china plates on the chest inside the coffins. And they couldn't figure out what was going on until somebody remembered that in the Welsh marches, not a stone's throw away from where you are in Bath even, you had a very strong tradition of village sin eaters. This is usually some elderly person who, for a small fee and some food, would come along and absorb the sins of the deceased where they were laid out in the house before the body was taken off to the church for the funeral. And what they would do is put a china plate on the chest with salt and bread on it. And the salt would absorb the sins from the body and take it into the bread. The sin eater would come in and eat the bread, and all would be well. And the last village sin eater, believe it or not, this is his tombstone here, died in 1906, as recently as that. It's in Rattling Hope Churchyard in Shropshire. You can go and look at it, because the goodly villagers decided it was a monument worth preserving, and so kind of repaired it about 15 or 20 years ago, I think. So it's in good shape. You can go and visit it. So the question is, given all this, what is it that makes people religious? The answer is, I think, because you have some kind of emotional experience, some kind of mystical experience of some kind. No one's ever joined a religion for theological reasons, although they may often concoct theologies after the event to kind of explain what's going on. But what motivates you, if you weren't born into a particular religion, is some experience, some semi-ecstatic experience. And this raises really three questions, I think. Why and when did religions evolve? Why did the doctrinal religions appear when they did, as opposed to this first phase of polytheistic doctrinal religions? When they emerged out of hunter-gatherer religions. And secondly, why did what we now refer to generally as the revealed religions, these are the monotheistic religions that we're familiar with today, all the big world religions, when and why did they appear? So here are some of the suggested functions of religion. This has sort of been widely discussed, and by and large, the theories have come down to something to do with managing your health, so the shaman view of religion, something to do with controlling the world. Theology gives you insights into how the world works and allows you to control it, and you can pray to gods and manage the world better, as it were, and that leads eventually to science. There's the kind of classic Karl Marx view that religion is the opium of the masses imposed by elites to control the masses. And then finally is the suggestion that religions are all about group bonding. In fact, if you look at the relationships between these elements, there are a series of, it turns out that there's a series of fairly straightforward processes in which external threats in primates in general, and humans in particular, are solved. And these are external threats in the form of predators or raiders from other communities, are generally solved by living in larger groups. That creates problems of how you bond the group to keep the group together. That creates the bonding process. Religion becomes part of that bonding mechanism. That allows cooperation. And in fact, it turns out that the bonding processes themselves have enormous health benefits. So they're really quite staggering. I'm not going to talk about those, but they're kind of interesting in their own right. It seems to me it's, if we could solve the social bonding component in communities, we'd reduce the health bill for the NHS by some enormous magnitude. Anyway, the problem we had is that, well, our primate cousins and ancestors lived in relatively small groups. Maximum size really is 50 animals on average in any one group. and did so by means mostly of social grooming. Social grooming triggers the endorphin system in the brain, which then provides the kind of chemical glue that creates this sense of bonding. The endorphin system, or the endorphins, are a neuropeptide that do lots of wonderful things in the brain. They're one of a kind of suite of neuroendocrine and neuropeptide hormones that allow us, our brains to function, indeed allow us to function. Sometimes they act as transmitters for the neural system. Sometimes they dampen things down. And one of the things that the endorphins do in particular is being part of the brain, essentially the brain's pain management system. So they're basically chemically related to morphine, and they produce this sense of relaxation and calmness and all's well with the world, being at peace and so on. This kind of opiate effect, which then seems to create this sense of bonding. And the problem, well, monkeys and apes sort of produce, and we still do, kick this endorphin system into action by physical contact, by stroking, essentially, by social grooming the fur, or in our case, hugging and patting and stroking and so on have the same effect. But as our group sizes increased through evolutionary time, we went beyond the limit at which groups could be bonded in this way, and it raised this sort of big question as to how we were able to bond the large groups that we live in when there are too many people to groom, as it were. You can't do it physically. And the way we seem to have done it is to introduce a series of new behaviors. We've discovered essentially a series of behaviors which happen to trigger the endorphin system extremely well. The oldest of these is laughter. Then what happens is much later, singing without words, sort of chorusing, if you like, and dancing come into play. And then finally, with the appearance of language, or fully modern language, you get the appearance of religion and religious rituals, feasting, and storytelling. And we've shown that all of these trigger the endorphin system. All of them create this sense of enhanced bonding. Just to illustrate these very quickly, we did one study trying to look at whether the rituals of religion triggered the endorphin system and created this sense of bonding. And we did it in a number of different contexts. So we were allowed into 13 mainly Protestant Christian services by 13 churches in the sort of Oxfordshire area, to have a look at how people's sense of bonding and belonging changed. We looked at 4 Sunday Assembly meetings. So the Sunday Assembly are a kind of secular form of Anglicanism. It's completely atheistic, but it's the sort of Sunday gatherings are mapped onto essentially evensong, Anglican evensong, as much as anything. So there's some singing of well-known songs and readings and kind of sermon-like things, and very often ends up with a shared meal, and the community who do this collect money for good works and all these kinds of things. And then we also went a bit more exotic, and we went off to Brazil, or at least my collaborators here went off to Brazil, and did very similar studies in 11 temples, congregations, I'm not sure what you call them actually, of one of the rather strange Afro-Brazilian syncretic cults that are extremely popular there. In this particular one was the Umbanda religion, which has a mixture of Catholicism and Yoruba religions from Nigeria. So every god has both a Christian Catholic representation, either as sort of the Virgin Mary or God himself or Jesus Christ, or the saints, and then they have a parallel spirit, if you like, version in the form of a Yoruba equivalent Yoruba god, very much built round trance dancing. You can see here in the background, you can see the men musicians providing the music, women in front are the priests or priestesses, I suppose you might say, who dance and go into trance. And the lady on the left, the bottom left there, kneeling on the ground is going into trance, and the kind of high priestess of the congregation is sort of managing her trance above her in her gold offices of as it were. And then we had a go at yoga classes, and this good lady here on the right-hand side ran these yoga classes for us, in which she presented yoga training as either completely secular, these are the physiological explanations that explain what you're going to experience, or done as religious explanations. Here's the yoga theory, as it were, with no scientific explanation attached to it. And all of these, we got very, very clear results showing that at the end of the service, the congregation both showed evidence of clear endorphin release, and what we use as a pain threshold change. So it's sort of how much pain can you tolerate. We measure that at the beginning of the service and then measure it at the end. And pain thresholds have gone up, meaning endorphins they could carry much more greater, or put up with much greater pain, demonstrably so. And that's the effect of the endorphins that have been triggered. And also they felt incredibly bonded to the other members of the community doing so. And this effect is very specific to the people you do it with. And here, just to reinforce that, is a survey study I did looking at various aspects of people's engagement with the social world. And in fact, the questions used here, which are listed there, are the ones that the government statistical office uses regularly as a standard format, and we found them quite useful. So we've used them a lot in our studies, but what I was asking here is, how often do you attend a religious service? Anything from not at all or once a year through to every day. And then they're responding to how bonded they feel to the congregation, how many friends do they have, do they trust the members of their local community, are they feel engaged with the local community, do they feel life is worthwhile, do they feel happy, do they feel depressed yesterday, these kinds of questions. All of them, you get this very strong effect. The more often you attend a religious service, the more friends you have, the more trusting you are of the community, the happier you are, the less likely you are to suffer from depression. But also you feel you are more increasingly bonded to the community. And this is what the graph shows, is that the sense of bonding you have to the members of the congregation you attend with increases dramatically as you attend more. In fact, you feel you're part of a community, and the number of people whom you feel you could ask for help, for example, if your life falls apart, increases dramatically. And for most of us, this average is very, very consistently about 5 people, family and friends. But for people who attend daily at religious services, they will often list 80, that every member of the congregation seems to be an intimate friend, as it were. Okay, so if religion is about community bonding, is there an optimal size for congregations? The answer is yes, it does seem so. Now, this beds into a key finding that we have a natural ideal group size of family and friends, our social network, as it were, personal social network, the number of people we feel we have meaningful relationships with in our extended family and our friendships. And that number characteristically is about 150. It's what's now known as Dunbar's number. And this graph on the left-hand side here just illustrates this. This is actually telephone call data from a very large EU country. It represents data from about 6 million subscribers and about 6 billion phone calls over the course of a year. And we're looking at the number of different phone calls that the subscriber calls and gets a call back from. So they have to be a call each way to count as a relationship. So that helps us exclude things like 08 and 100 numbers and the like, and phone calls to your solicitor or your doctor. Presumably don't call you back very often. These are your meaningful ones. Now, there's a range of variation, of course, between individuals, but you have this very, very strong peak at about 150 people. And this number turns up all over the place. We find it in the size of number of people invited to weddings. There's a database of American weddings over a decade, whole decade, 10 years, hundreds of thousands of weddings. The average number of people attending the wedding is 145. You find it in hunter-gatherer clans, the basic social grouping. They tend to average about 150. You find it in the Domesday Book. It's the average size of English villages in the Domesday Book 1,000 years ago. It was the average size of English villages was still 150 in the late 18th century, when the social demographers have been able to disentangle the size of villages from parish birth and death registers. Some very nice Italian data running from village sizes in the Alps, running from about 1250 AD to 1850, so 600 years, and the size is almost unbelievably consistent across 600 years, despite the fact the population's increasing. So this is very, very common. It turns out that the Protestant evangelical churches have been very exercised about expansion and church plantings and so on. Have long known that this is a critical size of group, that 150, less than 150 people, it's too much of a burden on the parishioners, the cost of maintaining the church. If you have more than 150 people, you start to get factions building up, and dissatisfaction with how things are being done by half the group, and very often causes a split. So it turns out to be quite important. Okay, so when might religions have evolved? There's two key issues here that give us clues, I think. One is the capacity to speak, because if we can't explain to other people what we think is going on, then we can't have a communal religion. By definition, religion really has to be communal in that sense, if it's going to be a religion at all. Otherwise, it's just personal beliefs. And the second one is the advanced mentalizing capacities that we rely on very heavily. These are sometimes known as theory of mind, or mind reading. It's the ability to understand what other people are thinking and what their intentions are. And both of these are required for religion as we know it. Let's put it that way. This is just in case you haven't come across this mentalizing idea before. This is sort of the development of that sequence. Children are not born with this capacity. They can understand their own minds, and they're then said to be in first order mentalizing. They believe something is the case. But then around about the age of 5, they understand that other people can have minds that are different to theirs. And at this point, they believe that somebody else believes that something's the case, which maybe they think is actually false, a false belief. And that's formal theory of mind, and it's a recursive process. We can start to have more and more mind states goes up to adults, who can normally work at about 5th order intentionality. So it's your mind and 4 other people's. And there's something key about that seems to kind of relate back to the complexity of the religious propositions that we can maintain. So we can have very simple beliefs. If you're in 2nd order mentalizing, I believe that God thinks, and that's the end of it. Or you can run at 5th order with something like, I believe that you think that we both suppose that God wants us to believe in him. And that starts to change the dynamics, because the 2nd order stage, I believe this, but why should you care? But if we are able to work at 5th order, we can come to some joint belief about it, which commits us both to the whole process. We can actually map these now with some reliability because they turn out to be related to the size of key bits of your brain, and we can estimate those from the size of skulls and fossil species. So you've got all the fossil species on the bottom, and they're predicted, if you like, mentalizing competences running up to fifth order in modern humans. And the key here is that there's a big shift that occurs in both the components, both the theory of mind component, the mentalizing component, and in language production, with the appearance of what are known as archaic humans, the Heidelberg folk and the Neanderthals, who descended from them, our sister species, if you like. That we have primate-like speech mechanisms, vocal mechanisms up until that point, and then suddenly at that point, everybody has human-like speech mechanisms and hearing mechanisms, and they're quite different to the ones we find in primates. So the earliest we might expect to see anything relating to things like singing and dancing and so on is going to be with the Heidelbergs 500, 600,000 years ago. But what's interesting is that fully modern mentalizing competences at fifth order don't appear until the appearance of anatomically modern humans. That's our own species, around about 250,000 years ago. So although the Neanderthals might have had some form of religion, it's probably not very sophisticated, and you don't get fully modern, sophisticated religions until the appearance of our species. Neanderthal mentalizing abilities. That big difference is crucial to how sophisticated they can be. Okay, so when did the doctrinal religions evolve? Well, they all appeared in the same place, it seems, and that's what's known as the subtropical zone, which is this little very narrow belt that lies above the two, or on the pole side, the poleward side of the two tropics, the Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn. Now, the southern tropic, there's very little land space down there, and most of it is desert anyway. But above the northern tropic, the Tropic of Cancer, it's very rich. And it's in here that we first see the appearance of evidence for doctrinal religions, temples, priests, evidence for rituals in some form, often sacrifices. So you can see sacrificial altars. The question is why? And the answer it seems to lie in the fact that actually, at the time these religions appeared, which was only about 8,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, the Sahara was incredibly rich, what's known as the Green Sahara phenomenon. There were a number of huge lakes. So these are the paleo lakes that were left behind after the last ice age retreated. And you can see these massive lakes in what is now the Sahara and Lake Chad below it. There were 5 enormous rivers running north to south across the Sahara, of which the only one that's still with us is the Nile over there on the right-hand side. But that whole area was rich in wildlife, incredibly abundant, and population sizes in humans, it seems, just exploded. And that's why we ended up having to live in villages, because people ended up basically fighting each other a great deal, raiding each other, and people, rather than living in dispersed communities like hunter-gatherers, they started to gather together in settlements where they could defend themselves more easily. That's why the early villages often have no external windows, and the only way in is through the roof across that whole belt. This area in the subtropical zone is really quite extraordinary at that time, because it had very good length of growing seasons, but the disease load that's caused by essentially ambient temperatures was much reduced within the subtropical zone. So if you live on the equator, it's a hothouse for new pathogens constantly. It's churning out even now new pathogens all the time. But once you get out of the tropics into the subtropical zone, it's too cold for pathogens to survive very well. And the disease load is much reduced, while the growing season is still very long. It allows plants, populations to be supported because it's very rich without having too much problem with contact diseases, if you like. And you can see this reflected in the genetics. So these are estimates of the female population sizes from the three groups of people: the Mediterranean hunter-gatherer stock, the West African farmer stock, and the hunter-gatherers of Southern Africa, estimated back in time from their genetic structure now. It's amazing what the genetics can actually tell us. But you can see that the South African hunter-gatherers, over the last 20,000 years, their population sizes remain absolutely stable. Whereas the Mediterranean hunter-gatherer stock, so these are the people sitting around that subtropical zone around the north of Africa and the Mediterranean basin and across into India and China, underwent a massive explosion in population size during this, what's known as the African humid period, when the Sahara was green. And this didn't really happen in West Africa until much, much later. So agriculture comes in much earlier in the Mediterranean area than in West Africa. This is a reflection of the pressure that people were under and why they were having to live in groups. And in that context, doctrinal religions then became important in allowing them to manage the stresses of living in very large groups. And again, just to illustrate that, here's from the archaeological data is the estimates of village sizes, the average village size in the Levant over the last 15,000 years from the end of the last ice age. You can see it just exploding at about 8,000 years ago onwards, so 6,000 BC. What's then interesting about this is you have a very rich population, very high density populations gathered together in villages. And then suddenly around about 1500 BC, so 3,500 years ago, you have this new phase of religions, the revealed religions. They're all monotheistic. These are them here. And their places of origin, and they all occur within the subtropical zone. Later in the Americas, but in the old world, there's this. They occur at about 1500 BC, within a very narrow time frame, within a very narrow spatial limit too, and they're all there. Including some that have drifted further apart. So you've got the Cushitic tribes and the Nilo-Hamitic tribes leading to the Maasai in Eastern Africa, who are all monotheistic. Their traditional religions are monotheistic, but they came down from the Sudan, from the bottom edge of that subtropical zone over the last 2,000 years. They've migrated southwards. Their origins and their religions derive from that same extraordinary burst of what are known as the axial age religions. The reason why that happened is the entire subtropical zone underwent an extraordinary period of drying at about 4.2 thousand years ago, so about 2,000 years BC. These data are the volume of the Nile over time, and you can see sort of on the right-hand side, it's quite high, and then suddenly at around about 4,000 years ago, the volume of water in the Nile just drops away, and then there's a brief upsurge again, then it drops completely, and the Nile reduces down from this enormous river to what we see now. We think it's big now. It was 10 times bigger 4,000 years ago. And the whole of the Sahara then became, over a period of about 1,000 years, became desert, completely desert. And you have all these people milling around desperately trying to find ways of surviving as a consequence of this desertification. So, and just to illustrate the effect of this, 10,000 years ago, baboons, the northern limit of baboons was up there, running across the top of Egypt, basically. It's now down there. That's something like 1,000 miles further south, due to these very large scale climatic effects, and it occurs right the way across the subtropical zone, across the whole of Asia. And what that's fairly soon afterwards associated with is something very weird, which is frequently commented on in the historical literature from this period, but nobody knows what on earth or who on earth they were, but it was the appearance of the sea peoples, and it's the general sense is that they came down out of Greece, yeah, but probably from further inland, further north. But they arrived in the kind of Eastern Mediterranean from essentially Libya and Egypt right the way around into modern Turkey in boats, often with their cattle and their women and children. And that happened about 3,500 years ago, about 1500 BC, and played absolute havoc with the entire economics and politics of this whole region. And most of every single city within a day's march of the coast was torched basically throughout this area. And if you look at the archaeology, you'll have this thick meter deep pile of ash at about this date. The only people that really survived were the Egyptians, who defeated them twice and then let them stay if they behaved themselves. But what seems to have been basically enormous migration forced these people to come down from Europe in search of new land somewhere. And of course, they ran into a hugely densely populated groups of people down here in the Mediterranean basin. And that's exactly when the axial age religions, the revealed religions, start to appear. And the question is, were they associated with an attempt to build together a stronger, much stronger bonded sense of community to resist this enormous conflagration that was sort of falling around people's heads? And some evidence that this might actually work. It's a nice study by Joe Henrich where they looked at the degree of religiosity in different parts of 3 countries during the course of a civil war there. One was Uganda, one was Sierra Leone, and one was Tajikistan. And what's measured here is essentially the likelihood of being a member of a religious group, either in counties or provinces of the country which were under experiencing the civil war compared to parts of provinces or counties of the country which did not experience the civil war. And the dark blue, they experienced the civil war, the light blue, they didn't. And you can see in every case, religious affiliation was much, much higher in those places that are subject to intense political and social and civil unrest. Okay, so where does this leave us? The story, I think, kind of makes a sense of a lot of the data. We can show a lot of the bits and pieces. The mechanics actually work the way we think it works. But we're left with some residual questions. So I'll just finish off by leaving them with you as something to think about. One is, it's very obvious that all the monotheistic revealed religions are associated with pastoral peoples, almost without exceptions. It's from pastoral peoples that they emerge. So Hinduism was brought into India by the Indo-Europeans, who of course came down as pastoral people with horses. They were basically horse-based people from round about the Caspian Sea. The Indo-European expansion, one lot came westwards and ended up demolishing all the local populations in the whole of Europe, except for the Basques, who are the only original inhabitants of Europe left behind, sitting up on their mountain fastnesses in Spain. The Zoroastrians, the Persians were largely, again, sheep-based pastoralists and as well as agriculturalists. Judaism, of course, famously associated with sheep, particularly the Mandeans, one of the other, and the Manichaeans, the Middle Eastern members of the Abrahamic community of religions, all again pastoralists and nomads. The Manichaeans in particular became very popular among the Uyghurs, from now confined to Western China, but also the Mongols. Islam in a context of Arabia, camel-based thing, the Cushitic and Nilo-Hamitic religions, the Maasai, the Somalis, these are all cattle herders, camel herders. There's something really weird about pastoralist systems that seems to make it very fertile ground for the initiation and creation of these kinds of monotheistic religions. We have no idea why, but it's an interesting question to try and explain. The second thing is one of the things that's very striking about these large-scale religions is how easily they fragment into cults and sects. They do it spontaneously and constantly. If you look through the history of Christianity, right from the very earliest days, Pentecost is the start of it, really. You get these mystical, trance-based, ecstatic cults and sects constantly springing up all over the place, and the papacy in the early stages and most of the hierarchies in the later stages, parts of history, devoted a great deal of time, energy, and money trying to suppress these erratic cults and sects in order to maintain, if you like, theological purity. The question is, why does that keep happening? They're almost always small. They're almost always built around a guru, a charismatic cult leader. And then the third question, which is kind of interesting to contemplate, is whether a secular religion is possible. The Sunday assembly people, in effect, are that kind of thing. Humanism provides another example. Is it possible to have a religion that doesn't have a belief in a spiritual world and in the membership of a spirit world, as it were, in the sense of God and gods and the like? So I'll leave you those three questions to ponder. And if you want to chase up any of these ideas, the main ones are in this How Religion Evolved book, but there are other elements of it in the Human Evolution book, another Pelican book up there on the left-hand side. And a lot of the theory, if you like, is in this book on friends and friendship. So at that point, I'm going to unshare my screen and go back to Don and take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Robin. You must have covered so much ground. I counted mystics, I counted trances, bonding, ideal community groups. Maybe all of us need to look at our Facebook page to see whether we've managed to get 100 friends by now. And then archaeology, movement of people, subtropics, the last ice age, and the agricultural revolution. So I think you definitely packed in a lot of stuff into religion and evolution of humanity. So we come to the Q&A session now. We've got roughly just under half an hour. We always start in the room, so who would like to go first? This lady here, very conveniently. Directly into it.
I would like to ask whether you have studied Northern European indigenous people, the Sami people of the northern parts of Norway, Sweden, Finland in particular, because we know that these people came into, that area after the last ice age, and they are a pastoral people in the sense that they herd reindeer, but other than when Christianity was forced upon them, they have never developed a monotheistic religion.
Right.
It's always been, more on a shamanic basis.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, but there is great interreliance within the communities, even to some extent nowadays, huge interreliance between the people and this close-knit group.
Yes.
And I wondered if you had studied that, because they are, of course, different in that they've never developed a monotheistic religion of their own accord.
Yes. Okay, a very interesting question, actually. I've spent a lot of time in Finland because a lot of my collaborators in Finland. Um, the the interesting thing about the Sami is, in many ways, where they are, right, way up in the north on the upper limits, and they're part of a long series of migrants that have appeared out of the Russian steppes and beyond over the last, well, ever since the Indo-Europeans turned up from our own ancestors. But you have, of course, all the Mongol invasions and waves and waves and waves, and they're part of that kind of Mongol, Siberian waves of migration westwards across. Well, I suppose they went eastwards into through Alaska and down into the Americas on one side, and then westwards into Europe on the other side. The big difference between these pastoralists and the pastoralists who evolved or developed these monotheistic religions is simply population density. You know, the Sami were able to live in very small communities, indeed, to some extent still do, that were village-sized, hunter-gatherer-sized, and there weren't that many, you know, the population density of both other folk that were already there, but also other groups of Sami in the same location were so low that you didn't have very much conflict going on between neighbors, essentially. The big issue in the Mediterranean basin, and you can see this going on through the Ganges plain in India with the Harappan Empire from about 5,000 years ago until its collapse around about 4,000, 3,000, 3,500 years ago, over into China, in the Great Basin in China. Exactly the same thing happened. At the same time, same latitude, same context. So you have this enormous population pressure creating incredible friction, forcing people to gather together in bigger and bigger groups. And it's just a classic case of, you know, if you live cramped up with too close to other folks, you end up falling out with them. And in some ways, one can characterize the problem they faced was how do you live in big groups without killing each other, basically. And a lot of the things we do in terms of social bonding are designed to kind of diffuse and mitigate the stresses of living in close proximity. But if you're living up in the sort of extreme north, or indeed down in the southern hemisphere, in the subtropical zone, because it was much drier down there and much more desert, population densities remained low forever, and you never had the development of village-based and city-based economies, simply because, you know, there wasn't enough pressure to force people to live together. So it seems to me that they're a very interesting example of precisely this whole process that I'm sketching out.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin. We've got quite a few questions online. I'm just going to start with a couple and then go back into the room.
Okay.
Roger says, you haven't mentioned the imposition of religion by elites, e.g. Constantine the Great and the Spanish in South America.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that argument is that, I mean, it turns out that all four of the arguments that have been proposed over the last 100 years, really, for the possible functions of religion that I sketched out at the beginning, all four of them actually work. The question is which came first and which were derivative subsequently. And I think the issue of elites imposing their beliefs was really something that arose in the context of doctrinal religions initially, but particularly so the revealed religions, and these are demographic thresholds, and the archaeology shows us very, very clearly, for example, that it's when village sizes or town sizes, whatever you want to call them, settlement sizes, exceeds about 400 or 500 people, that you suddenly get the appearance of doctrinal religions. Get this shift very, very quickly from casual hunter-gatherer type trance-based religions, shamanic religions, even in village contexts, into much more organized doctrinal religions with all the trappings that go with that. And that seems to happen when the village sizes get above about 400 people. And then the appearance of the doctrinal religions are all associated with local political groupings, small-scale empires, if you like, that contain about 1 million people. That seems to be a very, very robust threshold, because right the way across North Africa, Southern Europe, through India and into China, the appearance of these religions is tied into that particular size. And I think it's these are mechanisms designed to try and maintain a sufficient degree of peace that you can live and survive and do all the things you want to do in a community when the community is getting very, very large. And at this point, I think this is why you get the marriage of church and state, as it's sometimes referred to as, in which essentially you have an elite which controls religion. You find this very much embedded in the early doctrinal religions. Think of the Egyptians, the classical Egyptians, with their various priests and temples. You get priesthoods occurring who manage the whole process and restrict what can be done. Only priests can do certain kinds of rituals. Only priests can make use of certain kinds of narcotic substances which allow you to have these transcendent type mystical experiences. So you get things like alcohol being constrained, marijuana, opium, morning glory. The list is huge, the number of different chemical substances that are used which have these psychotropic properties. And whereas in hunter-gatherer societies, everybody can use them. Suddenly in these kind of societies, they're only the fully trained priests can use them and control them. And it's only one step between then the priesthood, if you like, the theological hierarchy, forming an alliance with the secular hierarchy. The state essentially is evolving at this time. Sort of big man society is leading into small kingdoms with individual kings. You have this alliance between the church and the state emerging to control, literally to control everybody, because you've got a top-down discipline being imposed. And what's interesting in this context is this is also exactly when you start to see formal judicial systems and formal laws appearing. They tend to appear when the population size is about somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000. So you've got doctrinal religions initially appearing when settlement sizes are about 400 or 500 people. And then as the settlements grow, when they go through another threshold of about 1,500, 2,000, then you start to see these kind of laws being introduced and judges to judge them and so on. Of course, they're very often judges and the priests are one and the same people. And I think what's going on here is that it's an attempt to manage the stresses by two different processes. One is top down. So partly that comes from, as it were, God wagging his finger at you and saying, look, these are my 10 commandments. You've got to stick to them for your own good. And that being reinforced by the secular powers and the religious powers in a form of top-down religion. But, and I suppose as we all know, because we all ignore the laws of the land most of the time if we can get away with it, People find top-down discipline irksome at the best of times, and they will literally ignore it, even when it's for their own good. And so the other side of the coin is to have this bottom-up effect of personal commitment to the religion, if you like, because that is much, much more powerful a force in terms of improving people's behavior. People will behave much better if they are deeply committed, and particularly if they're deeply committed for religious reasons, to the community, as it were, through the religion. So you've got a top-down and a bottom-up mechanism operating at the same time. But once you have, the bottom-up mechanism has been there forever, but the top-down mechanism comes in when the population just gets too big for the commitment to handle. And that problem seems to arise at communities of about 150, because that's the sort of limit on the number of people you can feel this sense of obligation to, that you will behave yourself, you'll hold back from misbehaving. And we've been able to show with the foundation of utopian communes in the Midwest in the USA during the 19th century that religious communes lasted much, much longer than secular ones. So there was a bit of a mixture of ones that were religious. You know a lot of their names, the Shakers, the Mormons, the Hutterites, so on and so forth. These are all still, you know them because they're still with us. But how many of you know the New Harmony community, which was founded in the 1930s, which was purely secular? In fact, it was founded by the founder of New Lanark, the famous community in south of Glasgow. He got fed up with English bureaucracy, went off to America, but New Harmony community lasted 2 years before it broke up. And what seems to happen, well, just to put some numbers on it, the average duration of secular communities is about 10 years. The average duration of religious communities was 70 years. So something, and they were bigger. So the difference in size, secular communities tended to only be about 50 people, religious communities about 150 people, so 3 times bigger. So something about religion is enabling more people to live together with less friction occurring.
Thank you, Robin. That's great. We've got quite a few questions in the chat room, but I'm just going to read out one more in the chat room, and then I go back into the room. This is from Andrew. Could you please say a bit more about the evidence for Neanderthals having more limited cognitive ability? Stephen Mythen has argued that they lacked metaphorical language. Do you agree?
Yes. Anything Stephen Mythen says, I dare not disagree with.
Good, but that was a very quick answer.
No, I think he was right. I'm doing it straight off the size of their brains and the neuroanatomical relationships we now know exist between these capacities and the size of key bits of your brain. And they basically tell us exactly what Stephen inferred. But there are no trappings of religion. You don't see any of the formal trappings of religion in Neanderthal archaeology in the way you do in anatomically modern humans, even at the same time periods. Their burials don't look like proper burials. They just chuck people down deep holes in the cave, whereas anatomically modern humans were starting to bury their dead in graves with grave goods, and grave goods implies there is an afterlife somewhere.
Good, thank you very much. We've got a question in the room. I'm going to ask 2 questions in the room and then I go back onto the chat room. So this gentleman here, if you speak directly.
I grew up in a Christian home about 70 years ago, and then I believed that the biblical world and the whole biblical environment was an enormously long time ago. Now I believe rather differently, much later. I think it only happened effectively the day before yesterday in terms of the whole history of the world. Do you agree?
I'm not sure what you mean by the time depths here, because the traditional Anglican theory, which due to the good Bishop Ussher in the, well, I don't know, what it is, 1780s or something like that, when he calculated the age of the Earth by stacking together all the ages of death of all the people listed in the Bible, and came to the conclusion, I think the world came into existence in 4800 BC, if I remember rightly, which would be very, very recent, long predates, long postdates what we know genuinely existed. Whereas now, I mean, the view is the Earth was created, literally created out of stellar clouds, whatever it was, 5 billion years ago or something like that, and that before that the universe was in existence for another 10 or 15 billion years before we even, or our solar system even appeared out of the mists. So I don't know what your time frame is here. I mean, there is I thought at one stage you wanted to say that you had the sense that history is really the history of religion is really very recent in reality, and the answer is yes, it is. In against the geological timescale of even the existence of our species, never mind our lineage back to the great apes 6-7 million years ago.
Okay, we've got another question in the room. I'm going to go to the back first and then come back there. We're going to go online after this one and then come back into the room.
Thank you. Thanks for a really fascinating talk. I was wondering if you would mind telling us if you were born into a certain religion and whether you've had one as an adult, and also whether in doing any of this research it's changed your view of the it's changed your view of the religious life.
Okay, so I guess the simple version of my upbringing, if you like, is that when I had some missionary grandparents in India, so I suppose both my parents were actually kind of what we would now consider Presbyterians. I got sent at the age of 7 to a Catholic boarding school and introduced in the usual serious way by religious, and a Catholic boarding school run by a religious order. So that was a serious introduction to Catholicism. And then I came to boarding school in England, which was Anglican, very strongly Anglican. So I've had a lot of close contact, if you like, with several different branches of Christianity. However, I grew up in East Africa because my father had been born in India and spoke Hindi fluently and all his life, and we spent a lot of time in and out of the very large and extended Indian community in East Africa, where we live socially and so on. I played with their kids, and through these I had first-hand experience of Sikhs, Parsis, Shia Islam, Hindus, Jains, and then because we were embedded in, and I was very interested in East African Swahili culture in particular, that kind of gave me a very deep, literally personal experience, as it were, access to Sunni Islam, because they were all Sunnis, having been influenced by Arabia. And at the same time, of course, we still had lots of native African religions still kicking around. So we're on the edge of Maasai land with their particular beliefs, the Bantu farmers with their traditional beliefs and traditional polytheistic religions surrounding us, as it were, on an everyday basis. And then later on, my cousin introduced me to Buddhism and yoga, in effect converted me into Buddhism. So I've been round the houses, I think is the answer, and dipped a good toe into all of them. But I would say from certainly mid to late teens at the outside, I haven't held any religious beliefs of any kind, but I kind of I suppose from an anthropological ethnographic sort of point of view, I have done the job that anthropologists would expect you to do of participant observation. That's to say, I've been embedded in a lot of these kinds of religions and seen them at work, as it were, at first hand. So I have a very good understanding of, I think, of how people feel in those kinds of different kinds of religious environments.
Okay, Robin, that's great. We call you omni faith and non.
Absolutely, yes. I've tried them all.
I've got another gentleman here in the room, and then I go online.
Hello. Now, looking at prehistoric societies in Britain, where you've got the Newgrange in Ireland, or the Orkneys, Maze How, etc., and then you've got those in Wiltshire, Stonehenge, Avebury, etc. These look to have been constructed by very large societies over quite a long period of time. Now, that doesn't seem to match with your suggestion that society sort of homed in on around 150 people. I was wondering how you could reconcile the two.
Okay. Well, the interesting thing about the henges collectively, and this comes out of an analysis that one of my former postdocs, who was an archaeologist, did looking at the Irish Bronze Age circles. He calculated the number of people you could get, assuming the circles are actually for civic occasions, as it were, where the whole community gathered together. He looked at the packing possibilities. How many people could you pack into these Bronze Age circles? And they vary in size. What's interesting is the sizes that they have mirror exactly the layering structure of human communities, one of which layer or the core layer is this 150 period. But there aren't many that are much bigger than would cope with about 150 people. And that's men, women, and children as a community, as it were. So that's one issue. They're actually, most of them, pretty small scale. I mean, there are a few spectacularly large ones like Avebury and so on, but most of them are of reasonably modest size. But secondly, the issue is not that humans can only live in groups of 150. It turns out more that 150 is the limit on the number of people you can have well-established relationships of obligation and reciprocity, because the relationships have history. People know who each other are intimately. They've lived with them for a long time. Without any kind of controlling impetus other than a sense of personal obligation. So that 150 layer seems to demarcate the layer in which you are generous to other people out of a sense of obligation. Once you go beyond 150, you're into transactional territory. You're into the economist's world, as it were, properly speaking. What humans have been very good at doing, and we're not the only species that do this, a number of other animal species also do it, but they just don't do it on the scale that we do, is we're very good at expanding the size of these communities by introducing mechanisms that allow us to control the frictions that otherwise are going to arise. So, and this is really the issue with the Neolithic settlements in the Middle East and so on, is that people were seemed to be being forced to live together for protection. And of course, they would insist on on reproducing, and therefore the community got bigger and bigger, reproducing faster than people were dying. So the communities got bigger and bigger through time. And you can see that in the size of the archaeological evidence of the size of the communities. I showed you on one of the graphs, going up dramatically over time from a few hundred people to 10,000 people, I think was the size of Neolithic Jericho around about 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And how you keep that number of people living in the same cramped space without falling out with each other constantly and beating each other about the head, or indeed stealing from each other, is the big problem they had to contend with, and I guess we still have to contend with. And we have been, as a species, extremely good at finding mechanisms and behaviors that allow us to dampen down the stresses and at the same time just make people behave slightly better than they might otherwise do if they were left to their own devices. And part of that comes out of creating a sense of a wider community of family, in effect. So your extended families in hunter-gatherer societies are about 150 people. That is the basic unit. But the rituals of religion and some of these other things like storytelling and singing and dancing allow us to create the pretense that very large groups of people, way beyond 150, are actually all our relatives. And that's what part of the rituals involved in religion seem very good at doing. They create this sense of belonging and community among anonymous strangers in a way which would otherwise be impossible. So it's a kind of trick of chemistry as much as anything else. But also...
Robin, can I just mention, because I think we're running short of time a little bit.
Oh, right. Sorry.
But I think just based on this, Steve has actually asked us to look forward into the future. And he asked, we now live with a larger population than ever, with bigger communities than ever, yet in a post-religious society. How do you see the future?
Armageddon is the answer. It's not a pretty sight. It's going to be very, very taxing to try and I mean, we see it all the time, all around us. Civil unrest gets worse. People behave less well in general towards each other, and you get far more conflicts going on the larger scale as we have now. Well, it's not novel. It's been thus, and just getting worse over a very long period of time. You either have to have a very good, in effect, police force which holds the lid on disagreements between people, or you have to have a very good sense of democracy. And I guess our solution, if we want to try and survive the next 5,000 years, is going to depend on us, stabilizing population size, preferably reducing it quite a lot would help, but also introducing a better sense of democracy and if you like, I suppose, fair play, of tolerance. If we can't do that, we're in deep, deep trouble, I'm afraid.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We need to find a global way of bonding.
Yes, absolutely so.
Easier said than done. Right,
yes.
one final question in the room, and then we need to draw things to a conclusion. There's a gentleman over there. Okay, you have the last say today.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say something about the 50,000 years of Australian Aboriginals and what they can tell us about the evolution of mentality, really. To my shame, despite being Australian, I know very little about them, and it seems to me to be quite remarkable. Probably because they don't have a written history, as far as I know. But has there any studies been made on what happened 50,000 years ago and whether it's changed a lot?
I was going to preface my remarks by saying, a fellow Australian, I hear. I spotted the accent. No, I spent my earliest years in Kalgoorlie, which mean nothing to anybody in the audience, probably, except you, but it's the middle of nowhere in Western Australia. I mean, seriously, the middle of nowhere. Yes, I mean, the Aboriginals got there remarkably quickly. Early on, after the last sort of the last major exit out of Africa, which was around 70,000 years ago, or the major exit out of Africa around 70,000 years ago. So there's some argument about just exactly when they got there. It varies a bit between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago. But anyway, it was very early, and they must have been running basically to get that far that quickly. And probably just being pushed along behind by other people. There was a massive population explosion in particularly the northeast of Africa around 70,000 years ago, which forced people to move across the land bridges into Asia and then round through Asia and down to Australia. The merit, really, from their point of view, I think, is that they bypassed, because Australia, even by then, was still relatively unlush. Surely wasn't as dry as it is now, but it was never as rich as other parts of Asia and Europe and Africa in terms of tropical forests and the like. So their population density is always low throughout time, and they never had these pressures. And it really is an issue about population density. This whole story is an issue about population density and how we've tried to cope with it. If you live at low densities, as was the case with the Sami and the Eskimos up on the American side, if you live at low densities, these problems don't arise. You can work very well with small communities of about 150, and you see these sizes very nicely exhibited in Australian Aboriginal demography, the sizes of their actual groupings that you get, the bands, and the bands, how the bands form clans, and the clans form tribes, and so on. So in terms of the cognitive capacities, we all have the same cognitive capacities. There seems to be no good grounds for supposing that any human races are any different from each other in cognitive terms, because we're much too recent a species to show much diversity at that level. Mainly because the brain evolves extremely slowly. You mess about with it, and it just falls apart very quickly. So the rate of change in genes related to the formation of brain is extremely slow compared to other parts of the body. It's a purely cultural issue that life was fine. They didn't have to sort of pressure it. They've still got a very rich culture. And it's that rich culture that you see all the way through. How do you bond the community? Well, everybody has their folk tales. Everybody has their histories of how we got to be here, what makes us special, and so on. So you're seeing exactly the same kinds of things as in Australia now, if you like, or right up until now, as has always been the case in Africa and places where we emerged from, or modern humans emerged from originally. It's just that the unfortunate people that settled in the subtropical zone ended up with the good fortune of having a very rich habitat, and therefore their population sizes exploded, which took them off into demographic territory, which was a nightmare, and they had to invent
Robin,
all these social institutions.
We're going to be running out of time very shortly. So, but thank you very much for a fantastic talk. It covered so much ground. Obviously, it will be available on our YouTube channel in about 6 weeks' time, so please refer back to it. But in the meantime, please give a great round of applause to Robin for a fantastic talk.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. And thank you for your question.